Welcome, everyone. Can you all hear me? Okay, I'm Jennifer Scapitone, and I teach here in English, creative writing, and romance languages and literatures, and I'm very excited to introduce Anne Boyer tonight, who has selected fourth-year student Cindy G. as winner of the New Voices Student Prize in Poetry to read alongside her. I hope you'll join us after these two readings for a little conversation and a reception, and to check out Anne's books, which are on sale via our beloved seminary co-op on the table outside. Literature is against us. Which us? The us of unpaid reproductive labor, the us with a strap affixed to our shoulders, the us of those on the nether side of consumption, the us that lives in colonial gardens on the night of the chemical spill, the us that needs and refuses the feeds, the us that reads literature and is sick with its prescriptors of natural repugnance to itself, who begins to write with her needle as Rousseau dictates an O, before seeing herself in a mirror and covering her sex. The us that struggles to be a person who can think and write regardless, that reads into the O a planet, a bruise, and X's out the days of sick leave and bourgeois eternity at once. I read Garments Against Women, Anne Boyer's latest book from Asada Press, and think of Zora Neale Hurston speaking of her blackness and implicitly of her femininity as a throttling frock. It was fitting like a tight chemise, Hurston writes. I couldn't see it for wearing it. It was only when I was off in college, away from my native surroundings, that I could see myself like somebody else and stand off and look at my garment. Then I had to have the spyglass of anthropology to look through. It's words, nevertheless, that enable her to turn away from the discursive structures that cloak her in conspiracy, exercisings in constraint whose negative spaces call for occupation. Refusal is also a touching against. This contradiction is one Anne Boyer bravely and continuously confronts in her writing. From the 2008 The Romance of Happy Workers from Coffee House Press, which C.A. Conrad delectably described as making me a compulsory vacuum, to the forthcoming Money City Sick as Fuck from Flowers and Cream, and many, many lines online and unbound. I am indebted to Anne Boyer for making it possible to make literature out of everything that would make it impossible for a me of the sort to write or even read. Anne Boyer says of this latest book's genesis, I wanted to figure out some way to live as something more than information. I wanted to figure out some way to write what we need that wasn't going to turn it into a pornography of particularization. Garments Against Women transcribes the scene of that figuring. The poet turns away from the garment that is literature, her tendriling of culture, and begins to work with needle and thread, absorbed in the hours of a garment worker's life held by each piece of fabric, each pattern, each seam. She summons Emma Goldman in her cell, asking for her jailers to at least bring her some sewing. She tackles the problem scores of anonymous women have tackled before in joining pieces so that they, quote, might correctly encase an eternally irregular, perspiring and breathing three-dimensional object that cannot cease its motion, unquote. She takes up the needle again, the pen, with a vengeance, in motion. In more recent writings on what Anne Boyer names the hypercapitalist disease of cancer, she has exposed further brutalities of swaddling, of care, and its excision from visibility. She has in observation ablaze contoured their calamitous intellectual consequences, which seem to point only toward the best-case scenario of becoming one further author of triumph in a neoliberal narrative market propped up on the survivor done up in data in pink. I would write an essay on this crucial emerging work now too, but I need to release her to fill this space. And so we'll repeat her apparently simple synopsis from a speculative interview with Felix Bernstein. My practice is all death and destruction now, she says, though mainly because that was done to me, like how I still write, though many days I can't even remember the word for thing. To make of excision a cenotaph rent. I kept checking the social fabric for the hole I'd burned, she writes. We are deeply indebted to Anne Boyer, whose bio line defines herself as a poet who lives in Kansas, for keeping those flames going across the plains and all their contradictions. Please help me welcome her here.
Well, tonight, I was trying to figure out what to read. I don't ever do that thing. You know, some people have a set and they read it again and again. And I always think I have to reinvent it every time I read. And I was like, well, do I write or do I read tonight about lambs or do I read about death? And then I thought, well, I can do both, right? And so that's what you're going to get. But before I get started with my own work, I want to read a tiny poem from the Venezuelan poet Mio Vestrini. With Cassandra Gillig, we've been translating some of her poems for a press in Venezuela, a small press that has a sort of beautiful art book that they've made in Spanish. They're going to release in English. It'll be the first official translation of her work in the US, and we're still finishing it up. But this is a tiny poem from that work by Mio Vestrini. What you write, it's not poetry. No, it's not. Certainly, you have many particular ideas about poetry. A flash of light on the sea, time arrested, the way a shoulder curves. So I guess it was a couple years ago, this magazine from the UK called Mute commissioned me for a thing called the Aesthetic Education Project. And I told them, I said, well, you have a choice. You can either take this fable I wrote about some lambs, or you can take this 5,000-word essay, 5,000 words of questions. And they chose the questions, but tonight I choose the lambs. When the lambs rise up against the bird of prey, the lamb is not innocent. The lamb knows how to read the motion of the air and knows the air's stillness. It knows the pattern of the bird of prey's flight, the slight shift in temperature provided by the bird's shadow, the sound of the bird's cry overhead, and the other sounds from which the bird's cry distinguishes itself. The lamb knows the general system of sound. The lamb must understand quietness too, in order that the lamb understands the quiet's relation to predation. The lamb knows how to read the quivering of the lamb nearby, how to become not one lamb, but many lambs in the formation of lamb-like relation, each lamb back moderately indistinguishable from the back of the next. The lamb knows how to read the feeling of the form of what is each other altogether, the fears and pleasures and neutralities of each other, the everything of what is expressed in a bleat or twitch when the lamb is with each other and the next one, and there is never one lamb alone. The lamb knows all it knows through awareness of the patterns embedded in a generalized state of risk. The lamb's way of sensing is a clear-minded sensing of the world as it aligns against it, demystified, dependent, and with brutality intact. The lamb, like all prey, and unlike any predator, is a scholar of the all. But the bird of prey flying overhead mistakes its expertise in corpses as proof of a general acuity. The bird of prey may have talents, but these only ensure it conceives of the world in an eye-to-claw to beak relation. The bird of prey makes only acquisitions. Its knowledge is a series of kills. The bird of prey understands a kill to be the world in its entirety, when in fact a kill is only dinner, and dinner is not the entire world. The bird of prey knows what it knows only in a system built from desire's instances, maintained in the expectations of desire's fulfillment. A hawkeye sees with the arrogance of only the particular of what it wants, not the whole of what is. A philosopher, the one who appreciated almost nothing about lambs, said, "The birds of prey may regard the lambs a little mockingly, and maybe say to themselves, we bear no grudge against them, these good lambs. We even love them. Nothing is tastier than a tender lamb." And it's true that for the bird of prey, like many predators, its hobby is the refinement of its own good taste, and it is good taste to taste the tender lamb. "I love the lamb," the bird of prey exclaims and means it. Its education is in desiring. Its form of desire is as narrow as wanting to taste. But the lamb is different. The lamb doesn't learn by following desire or by refining it. The lamb learns by understanding the world as a system in all of its variation and relation, so that it may effectively remain alive in it. What the lamb possesses, animated not by desire but by lambness, is a sensibility characterized by a philosopher, that one who appreciated almost nothing about lambs, as the vengeful cunning of the powerless. The lamb's intelligence is earned from a sensuous education forged in the negative. It's a cunning derived from fortune and necessity. Its genius is the bitter state that even insects possess. And if this genius becomes a taste, it's a taste made of grudge. In this, its taste is much like our own. We were not innocent. Our education was authored by our senses. Our lambness was written into our bodies with the violence of the world as it is, yet our interest in understanding the lamb's education, in the lamb's way of knowing, began to take the form of a bird of prey's pursuit. We were at once formed by grudge and narrowed by desire. In everything we wanted, in all we acquired, in how we could not want, how we could acquire nothing, we were simultaneously lamb and bird of prey. Our mixed nature was not innocent. No matter how much predator-like acquisition of the predator's way of learning acts upon a lamb interior, a lamb still appears to all who see it, just like a lamb. The lamb may be a doubly conscious lamb, but the bird of prey's stupid logic of dinner remains, for the time being, the logic of the world. So this is the saddest part of the fable. The part about the foolish lamb who wanted to show off what it had learned to the world that remained in the world's logic, the world. This is the part about the lamb who narrates, which means this is the saddest part of the fable, because the lamb who tells the story of itself as a lamb is the lamb who is rehearsing its own eulogy. It's the lamb who confesses to the wolf. To tell a story about being a lamb and to tell it in the language of a wolf is foreplay to the wolf's pleasure and prelude to the lamb's demise. The lamb, by making the predator's literature out of its education, risks enlightening the wolf to the lamb's defenses. For the wolf is a creature whose weakness, like the weakness of all predators, is intellectual. Like the bird of prey, it's arrogant. It is oblivious to all but the kill. This is the saddest part of the fable, because the lamb who tells is the talking kill, and sadder still that it is the one who often calls itself, because it is speaking the language of the wolf, it calls itself dinner. The lamb who speaks on the nature of lambness at any length in the forms made available by predators is the one who ceases to have the lamb-like cunning of the crowd of lambs. It talks, but it is no longer articulate. Alone, it is no longer a genius of the being that is all of the others together, each with the next one perceiving the all, and never with one lamb alone. The lamb who tells is a lamb whose education has failed it. Our education had failed. But we thought if we, the lambs who told, left the wolf's chamber and returned to the study of the general system, we could find a remedy for this. In the Gospels, the lamb that found itself too much among the wolves found the remedy was to become even more animals, therefore be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves. Were lambs always also snakes? Is this why there were so many specific architectures, so many laws and their enforcers, cameras embedded throughout the everywhere, and the clouds themselves, the police, and so many micro and macro expositions of specific and general violence? Is this why we were kept apart, so that we could not care for each other, so that we could never feel the cunning of the slightest motion of our friend's body, so that we could not tell our jokes to each other, back moderately indistinguishable from other back, in the whispers that make up revolt? This shrewdness, the one announced in every brick and lock of the architecture and every weaponized cloud, was rarely mentioned in the books written by the birds of prey. The lamb's shrewdness was denied in almost every philosophy, but the stubborn thesis of the danger posed by the minds of the lambs was written in the material everywhere of the everywhere there were lambs and those who would eat them. As lambs, we lacked philosophy and we lacked architecture, but we spent years in rigorous analysis of the merits of dove and snake. What was innocent? Were we Promethean lambs with snake-like cunning that could steal whatever of a predator's being is necessary, bringing it back for our own use, that we may exceed or abolish our lambness? Did we make a year of nothing but O's, the dove's annum? Many lambs work for years to steal fire, but do not know what use a lamb has for flames. When the lamb is a snake, is a lamb, and all culture rearranged is itself what is innocent as a dove, the judgment of our bodies, the judgment our bodies wrote in us would become a different day. The world was to be grasped in its all. Then it had to be sensed as what it is, which is already ours. In our imagined dove's annum, that year we had not yet lived in, that year made from the mistakes of our senses, we held our cognitive after the flood. There we were the lambs, appropriating the content of the sky and the field for the lambs. The shadows formed by clouds were a literature we had next to each other, and then the other already written it. We heard the love songs of the nearness of each other's backs. We saw the monuments in our shared perception of quivers. We knew what was above our head, not as hawk and as not hawk. We knew the air was the air. Our imagination was not innocent. We wrote messages to each other on our phones and on the internet. That's my other theory, beyond all my obsessive animal taxonomies, that what we must find lies right there between the vulgus and the vulnus, the crowd and the wound. Had I gone too far with the portrait of our times? This loosened a fable of ressentiment. I wanted to shake the lamb out of moral philosophy. I did this so that what the lamb knows, to never mistake dinner for the totality, can finally be of use. This one's called Communist Poem. It's April 5th, 2011, and almost to the soundtrack of a 13-hour lecture on Das Kapital. My child pulls a magnolia off the neighbor's tree and yells, "I did it." I tell her stealing flowers is very important, and not yelling in a large voice that you have stolen them is also important. The flower she stole and the flower I stole float together in the water the kittens drink from. I'm going to read one thing from this book that came out this year called Garments Against Women. As I went to try to figure out what to read from this book, I actually remembered that this originated in reading the work of somebody at University of Chicago, Linda Zarelli's Feminism and the Abyss of Freedom. It started as notes, as reading notes on that text, it's been a really important book in my thinking. You wouldn't be able to tell probably at all from what I'm about to read, but there was its seed in the kind of margin notes of that work. So now it returns home, I think. It's called Science Fiction. Chapter 1. One imagines that one can escape a category by collapsing it, but if one tries to collapse the category, the roof falls on one's head. There a person is then, having not escaped the category, but having only changed its architecture. Once it was a category with a roof, now it is a category in which everyone is buried in the rubble made of what was once a roof over their heads. Chapter 2. In the history of all hitherto existing societies, there is fantasy and there is fantasy. The unpredictable, heaving plurality that is not really men is no fantasy, but the category of men provides the same show every day. Someone says, would you be better if the show were a little different? And you say, yes, 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 you're merely bored. You tell them you're weary. You tell them you've seen the show so many times. But it's not really too bad, maybe just a few changes. But you can see some other things. Like what they say is a stage, is the actual heaving everything of the human everyone. It requires no separate class of actors upon it. You watch the form of men as they act with each other in ritualized opposition to create the illusion that the actors upon the stage are, in fact, the whole scene. They've been playing at the same struggle for a long time. To keep their struggle theatrical fixes power. But there is another real struggle. It's not between actor and actor. It's between the actors and the stage. So now, on to the second part. We've moved from the lambs. So I was sick last year, which was kind of horrible, but it was also kind of a research project. Ultimately, that as it was happening to me, as I sort of moved into the realm of serious illness, and I moved like really fast, a matter of weeks, from being a person who thought I was healthy into a person who was being made increasingly sick by medicine to treat my illness. And I began to experiment and to research and to think of ways to deal with what was happening to me and to understand it. And part of what we had to do, because at that point I was a single mom and I work for a living, right? I don't have any like backup plan. And so there I was dramatically ill, so people had to arrange to take care of me when I couldn't take care of myself. And my friends began to come from all over and they scheduled these visits from all over. It was really great. I have really interesting friends. And as they would come, we would begin to create theory out of my illness, and we would begin to write collaborative poems out of my illness, and we would do performances and interventions out of my illness. Some of it is so great, I still can't even sort of tell the story of the things that we did when I was sick. But part of what happened to me was I lost my hair in chemotherapy. And you may know, if you've known anyone who's been through chemotherapy, they're these kind of like these received rituals of hair loss, right? Like the people, they take the photos and they have parties and they shave their heads and all of that. And for some people that gives them a lot of power, but for me I didn't find that to be a particularly fulfilling thing. It seemed to fall into certain kinds of narratives that actually made the illness that I had much worse. And so my friends and I, as my hair began to fall out, did these sort of fantastic things with it, right? We used my hair as a form of art and a form of revenge. And I thought, well, okay, I can write some of this down as like a set of instructions in case somebody else needs another alternative to what happens. And part of the thinking here comes from my friend Laura Long, too, who took care of me a lot. And we had been reading Socialist Patient Collective's Illness as a Weapon and thinking hard about what it meant to be a sick person under current conditions. And so this is kind of for her. And it's called, Is Ossel Loading a Gun? Pull your hair out by handfuls in socially distressing locations. Sephora, Family Court, Bank of America. In whatever location at which you do your paid work, while in conversation with your landlord, at Fort Leavenworth Prison, however, in the gaze of men. Negotiate for what you need because you will need it now more than ever. And if negotiations fail, yank your hair out of your head in front of whoever would deny you. Leave clumps of your hair in the woods, on the prairies, in the Quick Trip parking lots, in front of every bar at which your conventionally feminine appearance earned you and your friends' pitchers of domestic beer. Leave it at all the intersections at which you were always waiting for the light to turn. Put your head out of the window of the car and let the wind blow the hair off your head. Let your friends harvest locks of your hair to give to other friends, to leave in socially distressing locations, to scatter at ports, to scatter at national monuments, to place inside the architecture built to make ordinary people feel small and stupid. Pull out your pubic hair in clumps from the root and send it in unmarked envelopes to technocrats. Leave your armpit hair at the Superfund site you once lived near, your nose hairs for the director of human resources who denies you leave. When your eyelashes fall out, send them as a reverse wish to every person who has, at your illness, disappeared. Your hair will fall out onto every surface you come near. It will fall into new alphabets and new words. Read these words to discover the etiology of your illness. Know the new alphabet spell mostly capitalism. If you are lucky, you will read another word that means illness has turned you into an armament. In the bald spots, you will read how to weaponize your dying cells against what you hate and what hates you. As you see a weapon in your falling hair, you will see your body as it falls is also a weapon, also as it doesn't fall. In this new theory of being a sick woman, your friend will say that caring for you is now to care for arms, that you have turned your sick room into an armory, that everyone who brings you water or brings you food is also now loading a gun. Should I talk about the Smurfs for a second? This is a very sad story. So does everyone know who the Smurfs are? Some of my students don't, and I don't know what has happened to education in this country. Clearly it's dismal and inadequate. So yeah, this is both lambs and death now in the Smurfs. So there's this Smurf named Poet Smurf. Do you remember Poet Smurf? And Poet Smurf is the Smurf who, when he speaks, everyone falls asleep, right? And he trills, and he's always writing these like fantastic odes to like straight lines or whatever, and nobody cares about him. But then one day he writes a poem, and everyone's like, wow, Poet Smurf can write poems about us. Right? Poet Smurf can immortalize us, and they all want poems, and they want these poems that reflect the virtues of the community, and they gather around him, like, write this poem about me, write this poem about me. And Poet Smurf is so excited, and he has his quill, and he starts to write, and he can't do it. He has writer's block, and he tells the other Smurfs, the Smurf community, I'm sorry, I have writer's block. And they say, what is writer's block? And he says, it means I don't have any more words. And so the Smurfs say, oh, we can Smurf this, right? And they decide to give him words like stupendous, right? And they're there and they're shouting words, they're giving him vocabulary. It's like they don't get it, right? When I say I don't have words, like I mean I don't have words anymore for the ideas, like for the figures in my mind. And so inadequate to his position in the community, Poet Smurf decides to like self-exile from the Smurfs. And so he walks along, right, and he gets to the kingdom of the wildebeest. And the wildebeest king meets him and is going to eat him, and he's like, don't eat me, I'm a poet. And the wildebeest king's like, yeah, you're right. And I don't want to eat you, poet. And he says, but I have a job for you. And so he takes Poet Smurf to meet the wildebeest princess, and she had been cursed. And in this curse, she was in a stupor, and she couldn't come out of the stupor until she was made to cry. And so there she was, this old wildebeest woman in a young wildebeest girl's dress, unable to move. And the king's like, well, here you are, a poet, you can make the princess cry. And, you know, the king's generally right that poets make people cry. But Poet Smurf has this terrible case of writer's block, and he can't do it. And the wildebeest king says, if you can't make the princess cry, I am going to send you to the Valley of the Wolves to die. And he still can't make the princess cry, and he goes to the Valley of the Wolves, where he's going to meet his inevitable end. And as he prepares to die, he begins to think about his friends. And he thinks about how much he's going to miss them, right? How he's going to miss Papa Smurf just for being Papa Smurf, how he's going to miss his friends not just for what they do, but who they are. And he's filled with this incredible grief, and he begs the guard, he's like, please just let me write one more poem. Like, I just have to write one more poem. And so he writes this poem about how much he's going to miss his friends and how much they mean to him. And he tells the guard, he's like, put this under a rock because my friends are always lifting rocks. And they'll find this. And so the guard doesn't do it. The guard walks away and he reads the poem that poet Smurf writes and he begins to cry, right? And he takes it to the wildebeest king, and the wildebeest king begins to cry. And the wildebeest king, while weeping, reads it to the princess, who begins to cry, and she comes back to life. And so they go, they're like, we better see if Poet Smurf's still alive, right? So they go to fetch him, and he's like still alive, and the wolves have been howling, and he's a little shook up. But and so he decides now that he's got words again, he can go back to Smurf Village and take his rightful place in the community, and the rightful place in the community, according to the Smurf Wiki, is as the least talked about Smurf in the series. And so that's the story of how Poet Smurf has writer's block. Well, this is also the story of how I wrote the work that I wrote in the past year, which is that there I was thinking I was going to die and thinking how much I was going to miss my friends. And so I wrote and wrote. And I'm going to read part of what I wrote then for you now. But first thing, so here I am facing the problem of illness, I'm facing the problem of death, I'm doing all these things, and I decide that, you know, philosophy is here to teach us how to die, and literature's here to teach us how to live, but there's nothing that teaches us just how to be dead, and that seemed like it was going to be a big challenge for me, like staying that way. So I began to look at all of the literature available about what it's like to be dead, because it seems fairly arrogant that there's nothing on the other side there. And other cultures have done a really excellent job of providing instructions, but as you probably know, the Egyptians were super at this, right? They had all sorts of spells and all sorts of incantations that you could learn for the underworld to protect you there. And one of the things that you may know about the underworld is you got to watch what you eat there. And the very last spell in the Egyptian Book of the Dead is against eating shit, because that's what they want you to do. In the underworld, there's still a class struggle. So when you die, just remember, don't eat shit. And this is my rewriting of the last spell in the Egyptian Book of the Dead. What I really hate, I will not eat. And what I hate is shit, and I will not eat it. What will you live on, say the powerful to me, if you won't eat shit? What will you live on in this place to which you have descended? I will live on what is already ours. The powerful say, where will you eat what you claim is yours, which we highly doubt is real? They say, where will you even find the real estate on which to eat this imaginary, who in your other life couldn't afford half a duplex? I will eat under the tree of the dead women, for there are loaves there for all who need them. There are people who arrange themselves in the quality of their affections, their hatreds, and their adorations, along with arranging the motions and production of their bodies, so they do not have to eat shit. In this place, there are people who will answer the door. I will not be subdued by the powerful. As I descend to this land, I will not be contaminated by the shit the powerful want me to eat, the shit they say is inevitable. Get away from me, all who want me to eat shit. I have flown up into the heavens like a swallow. I have cackled like a goose. I have landed on this tree of the dead women in the middle of this island, in the middle of this flood. I have flown up and I have landed. I have descended into this flood, but I have not drowned. And what I hate, I will not eat. And what I hate is shit, and I will not eat it. What my soul hates is shit, and it will not enter my body. Even when I am dead, I will not believe when they tell me eating shit is inevitable. Even in the underworld, I will not do it. I will never descend upside down for them. Okay. So part of the thing that I began to write this and to think about being dead, and I began to think about liturgical writing and doing these sort of different things, like a Book of the Dead, and then finally a kind of Book of Revelations called Death and the Maiden, which was the weekend before my last chemotherapy, and I was really feeling it, and I didn't know if I was going to live or die. Like, I was in bad shape, and with each chemotherapy treatment, you suffer more and more brain damage, and it wipes out like the verbal centers of your brain, and so I knew this going in, and I would like watch my decline, but I still kept writing during it. And before the last one, because I was feeling so bad and my nerves were dying off, and I just wanted to write everything I could, like the poet Smurf in the Valley of the Wolves way, because I was so afraid of what might happen, and of all the things I was afraid of. It wasn't even dying. I think it was just the fear of not having written everything I wanted to write. And so what I'm going to read now is the very last piece in that book of visions, called Death and the Maiden. And this piece is about the opera La Traviata. If you've never seen La Traviata, it has the longest death. So the last act, Violetta just dies and dies and dies, and then she sings the whole time, even though she's got tuberculosis. It's great. So it begins with a drinking song and ends with death. The process goes on for what appears to be forever. First, there's Violetta's misamorous swearings, bring back the flowers when it is wilted. And then there's Violetta's humiliating mistreatment by men. Then Violetta is on her deathbed as the sounds of carnival rise up from the street. Then Violetta is thinking of how she was herself once a carnival. Then there's Violetta asking of the revelers, do you know how many suffer? Then she's declaring, I will go out. She looks for a nice dress, but Violetta is too weak to party. Then there are Violetta's many false and frequently occurring deaths, followed by her false and frequently occurring resurrections. Everyone is singing, great God, to die so young. And finally, there's Violetta's excessive death, the one postponed by singing and from which she almost resurrects to never resurrect again. How many times must Violetta die like this? In how many cities? On how many stages? In how many beds, wearing how many nightgowns, in the arms of how many blandly talented men? How many curtains must be drawn over Violetta? How many orchestras must wait from their pit? The law exists in order to make certain that Violetta will always be dying. The law won't transform the social order of her always dying, but preserve it, and the law appears at the moment of the social fissure in which the pressure of the status quo threatens to destabilize itself. The law that Violetta must die then, and always in almost the same way, does not exist to transform society, but to regulate society's regular condition. The law forbids a happier third act so that it might permit what happened during intermission and then again after everyone else has bowed. Law's permission is not for Violetta, but for the percussionists so that they might fall asleep later in their underwear, for the maestro so he may drink his latte, for the people watching in their suits to go to the office again in the morning for the sake of business. The law's forbiddingness is lavish toward every Violetta. Sometimes there are laws which have been made not to preserve but to radically transform, perhaps some legislation to conduct a case without a Violetta in it at all. That's when the law stops being a law, just as no law could structurally correct the event of Violetta always dying. So it is that every law makes a claim to do so. And this is why we return to this performance season after season, hoping it will end a different way. That each law inevitably fails, however, at its project of writing La Traviata is also fundamental to the nature of the law, which is often a promise that only keeps itself in the form of a threat. What the law must do is always end the life of Violetta in order to protect the show. What the law is no guarantee of what's right or good or should be, only the guarantee of what already is. So why should we stay for the third act? Is this the time that Violetta would live? And yet we stayed, unable to bring ourselves to be deprived of music. Rousseau said it would take gods to give men laws. It would also take a funeral director. When there is a law that can't be a law for the law's anxious categorization, the law-like thing that isn't must find a new name. The last time I saw her die, Violetta didn't die exactly. She rose from her deathbed, like she always did, swearing she had come alive again, and fell down dead, as she always had. But when the curtain fell to, it caught on the chest at the end of Violetta's bed. The audience clapped, then Violetta's delicate arm emerged under the curtain, sweeping it clear. This was so the curtain could fall completely. Violetta was dead, but in this particular death, she was still moving. And a law that exceeds the bound of law, or mistakes law's self-preservation as its true aim. What is that law but poetry? And then finally, what resembles the grave but isn't. Always falling into a hole, then saying, okay, this is not your grave, get out of this hole. Getting out of the hole, which is not the grave, falling into a hole again, saying, okay, this is also not your grave, get out of this hole. Getting out of that hole, falling into another one, sometimes falling into a hole within a hole or many holes within holes, getting out of them one after the other, then falling again, saying, this is not your grave, get out of this hole. Sometimes being pushed, saying, you cannot push me into this hole, it is not my grave, and getting out defiantly, then falling into a hole again without any pushing, sometimes falling into a set of holes whose structures are predictable, ideological, and long dug, often falling into this set of structural and impersonal holes, sometimes falling into holes with other people saying, this is not our mass grave, get out of this hole. All together, getting out of the hole together, hands and legs and arms and human ladders of each other, to get out of the hole that is not the mass grave, but that will only be gotten out of together. Sometimes the willful falling into a hole which is not the grave, because it is easier than not falling into a hole really, but then once in it, realizing it is not the grave, getting out of the hole eventually, sometimes falling into a hole and languishing there for days, weeks, months, years, because, well, not the grave, very difficult still to climb out of, and you know after this hole, there's just another and another. Sometimes surveying the landscape of holes and wishing for a high-quality final hole, sometimes thinking of who has fallen into holes which are not graves, but might be better if they were. Sometimes too ardently contemplating the final hole while trying to avoid the provisional ones. Sometimes dutifully falling and getting out with perfect fortitude, saying, look at the skill and spirit with which I rise from that which resembles the grave, but isn't. Thanks.